Hello, and welcome to a Sunny Book Nook. Today I am going to be talking about a bunch of book tropes that I love and adore in stories, and if my bookshelf looks a little empty, it's because I tried to take off the books that I'm going to be talking about that fit into these various tropes in advance. So obviously I read a lot of books that fit into these tropes, either because like in my mind when I pick out the books to like buy or get or whatever, I am thinking, oh, I feel like this is going to fit this genre of book that I really enjoy, or I just end up reading a lot of those types of books that then I later on look back on and think, oh, those all kind of feel the same, or they're all similar in like one type of way. If you know me, if you have been subscribed to this YouTube channel, which you should if you aren't already, you'll know that I read a pretty wide variety of genres and audiences and types of stories. Like, I really enjoy literary fiction, but also sci-fi, fantasy. I like reading middle grade and also young adult. I like contemporaries. I like historical fiction. I like magical realism. I like weird stuff. I like a huge variety of things, okay? So, which is why I feel like the tropes, this kind of ultra-specific tropes that I do like, or like things that are common in the books that I read that I really enjoy, I think is like pretty interesting. So if you have any book recommendations that fit into any of the tropes that I like say, please comment them down below. I would love to hear them. So the first trope that I have here is I love when women kill and manipulate and are evil to horrible men. Like when they gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss, everything. I'm obsessed with it. Like, for example, in They Never Learn by Leighton Fargo, which I think me, Books and Lala, and Perks of Steph are doing a live show on later this month. Love that book. I think it is a great example of women kind of using the power that they have and the power that they've gained over time to try to bring about justice in a deeply unfair and patriarchal world. Also, similarly, Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter. This book is very gritty, dark, and graphic almost. Well, not almost, it is very graphic, and there's a lot of really clear and obvious sexual and gendered violence throughout the entirety of the story that is on page and very deftly described, but also the way that the themes and the storylines and the character development all kind of come together in this way that really shows how men are insane. Like, they're crazy, and especially the ones that have money and power and security, and the ways and the lengths in which they go to try to control less powerful people and abuse women. So those are some examples, and a book that's on my TBR that I think I've heard is a good example of this trope. Hold on, let me go get it. It's on my TBR shelf, which is on the other side of this bookshelf, which is books that I have read. So a book that I haven't read that I think should fit this trope is Foul is Fair by Hannah Capin. I think this is a rape revenge novel, a young adult contemporary about a teenage girl who seeks revenge on her rapist. And, you know, I've heard good and bad things about this, so I'm excited to get to this at some point in the near future, hopefully, and finally understand whether this does fit into my women killing men trope that I really enjoy. I feel like movies that kind of fit into that genre, not even necessarily of like women like killing men, but like women like doing crimes in a very epic, awesome way. One of my favorite movies of all time is Birds of Prey, The Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. Love that movie, and it's all about girls doing crimes against guys who do worse crimes. I also love Ocean's 8, so good, and, you know, all-star cast. I also love, I really enjoyed I Care a Lot, which was released on Netflix a couple months ago. I thought that was really fun. Just, like, high-intensity, high-drama things, like Molly's Game, stuff like that, right? If you have any other books or movies that kind of fit into this trope or genre, let me know. The next genre of story that I personally really enjoy is like a very wild, crazy satire that kind of satirizes capitalism or these larger systems at play through things that are either like outrageously ridiculous or sometimes like deeply unbelievable, but also very like funny at points. I'm thinking of the movie Sorry to Bother You, directed by Boots Riley. Love that movie, and I know that a book that got recommended or was pitched as like a Sorry to Bother You kind of book was Black Buck by Matteo Scaripour. If you haven't watched my review of this already, you should do that, linked in the cards. This book is a very wild ride from start to end, and it's framed in a way that's like this man who is telling us how to succeed in business as like a young person of color in these fields that are predominantly white, predominantly filled with people who have nepotistic connections and come from wealth, but how to succeed as a business person, even if you are not advantaged in those ways. And we follow our main character as he gets into this company that is insane and puts him through hell and back, and how it entangles his relationships with other people and his mental health and everything, his community. I thought that this was a very scathing and brilliant kind of hot take on how racial capitalism and like corporate America works. And I feel like not as many people really enjoy this, not to be like, oh, people just don't get it and people, it's just going over people's heads, but I really do think it is kind of going over people's heads because I think that the fact that this book is like a black comedy, like you can't go into it with a sense of like hopefulness, almost like the movie Parasite. I feel like you go into it trying to root for our main characters, but we see the morality of the situations at hand, and we see as it plays out in this gradually darker and darker way. So yeah, this is one of the books that I really enjoy that kind of satirize these larger systems of oppression at play. And a book that's kind of like darker than that, but I still think does a good job of satirizing these systems of oppression is Docile by K.M. Spara. This book is so fascinating. The tagline is "There's no consent under capitalism," because it's set in a world where debt is now inherited. So people who, you know, are just normal ass people whose parents like went to college and their parents went to college and they try to go to college. Now they have the debt of all of those people's like student loans being passed down onto them. So now there's so many people who are like millions of dollars in debt, can barely survive, and it's like this kind of dystopian near future where there's this company where there's a new like social system in place where you can sell yourself out or be hired as a docile, which is basically like a servant who is entirely at your beck and call, and you know that's called a docile. So this docile, most of the time, due to the development of society and like contracts and stuff, as a docile, you have the rights to take or refuse this thing called docilin. And docilin has been developed by this like huge biotech pharma company that creates these like injections that makes you basically like a brainless like zombie when you're in the state of being a docile for however long your contract is. And our main character, what's his name? Elisha. Our main character, Elisha, is from like the outskirts of like the rich city where the headquarters of this biotech company is, and he knows that his mom was a docile for like 10 years or something, and because of that, because of her experiences on docilin, she is now like a shell of herself, like completely out of it, is no longer herself, and is, you know, basically just she like the drug has affected her in a way where she's basically been like stripped of her humanity and what makes her who she is. So Elisha knows that even though he has to go into being a docile so that he can hopefully try to pay off his family's debt so that his little sister can have possibly a better life than him, he enters this contract as a docile but refuses to take docilin. And most of the time, like basically in every other case throughout the history of docile use, people have chosen to take docilin because that way you don't have to remember any of your experiences, and you don't have to remember being dehumanized in a way in which you're being treated like a literal servant and sex slave, and, you know, being abused of your humanity, because the rich people who do have these dociles treat them as like like dolls, basically. So our main character, Elisha, undergoes a contract to go on go as a docile, but he is working for the son of the CEO of the company that makes Docillin. And this book talks about the nature of what consent really looks like under capitalism. Consent to work, consent to sex, consent to relationships and power dynamics and hierarchies at play. And I think that it was just such a dark look at grooming and abusive relationships from the perspectives of the abuser and the abused, and what the process of that can look like and how it forms and shapes your own identity, and the ways that the systems at play that kind of determine what is and isn't consentable is just very interesting. And I just thought that thought-provoking element of the what if we took this idea to the extreme, which is what I feel like satire is in a lot of cases, it does this in such a heartbreaking way, and I really enjoyed it. So if you have any book recommendations or movie recommendations that kind of remind you of this, or Bong Joon-ho's films, or Sorry to Bother You, let me know, because I love that genre of media. The next genre or trope that I really enjoy, a fantasy or sci-fi universe that is really embedded in class consciousness and fundamentally operates off of the ideas of like anti-capitalism and Marxism. I'm obsessed with books that can talk about revolution and rebellion and class awakening and mobilization and organization on a political level in a sci-fi fantasy universe, because there's so many different ways that you can take it, especially when you incorporate magic and magical relationships into these societies, the ways that these class dynamics and powers can play out. It's fascinating, and I love it when I can see it. And some examples of this type of book is Mistborn: The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. The entire Mistborn trilogy, I think, does such a wonderful, amazing, incredible job at creating this world that is built on class hierarchy, almost post-apocalyptic in its high fantasy. It takes the idea of an individual struggle, of a rebellion, and kind of turns it on its head, because, there's no such thing as rebellion led by one person. Social change is social. It is a thing that occurs with many people, and social mobility in organization. And I think that Brandon Sanderson's books kind of talk about that in a very interesting way, while also incorporating these main characters that have a lot of high positions of power, or who are vying for those positions. And I think another example of a book like that is Brandon Sanderson's other high fantasy novel. I think this is standalone, Warbreaker, which I talked about pretty recently, where kind of the discussion of war and cultural differences and class differences and the realities of the material realities of being poor or being from a certain country with certain customs and certain religious values can really fundamentally shift and determine who you are as a person and what you choose to do, and what you choose to do. So yeah, I enjoy both of these books, and I think they're really good examples of what I think of when I think of these fantasy novels that can encompass these really complicated ideas about, well, they're not even complicated. These ideas about power and who has it and who wants it and how are people using it to their advantage or for others. I think I just really like how Brandon Sanderson explores that in these books in particular. And I think another good example of this is the We Set the Dark on Fire duology by Taylor K. Mejia. This YA fantasy duology not only is sapphic, not only is enemies to lovers, but I think that the way that rebellion is described from the perspectives of those who don't want to rebel, those who are forced to rebel due to their position within society and due to things that are out of their control, and those who choose to rebel, and how that all plays out within a society that is so stratified by class and so repressive. And I think that these books do such a wonderful job of portraying that and you know what I really enjoy about this particular type of book and story. Another good example of this genre or trope that I really enjoy is The Midnight Lie by Marie Rutkusky. I did a full-length video review on this, which I'll link in the cards above as well. This book is also YA sapphic. There's a common theme here of sapphism and class consciousness. Think about it. This fantasy world, I think, is built in a way that isn't too overwhelming or too detailed, but still really gets the point across in the way that all these relationships that we see be built and play out throughout the story kind of inform and are informed by the class systems at play, which are fundamentally tied to the magic systems in the society, which I just love. Okay, sorry if my background looks a little bit different. I just wanted to put the books that I already talked about back on my shelf. So another genre of book that I really enjoy is stories that are wild and unexpected from beginning to end. Like, and the only book that I feel like fully embodies this trope in the way that I'm trying to discuss it is The Hike by Drew Marguerite. This book feels like a video game, fever dream, adventure novel, almost, survival novel. Because this guy who's just your typical middle-aged dude who works in an office goes to this work retreat at this like hotel, and then he decides to go on a walk, go on a little hike before he settles in and has to do his meeting. But on his hike, he then starts seeing some weird fucking things, and he's like, what the hell is that? And he realizes, like, longer and longer, he doesn't know where he is, and he can't go back to he can't find his way back. And the entire novel is seeing him as he, like, stumbles upon, like, a beach with, like, a talking crab, and then he has to go break into this, like, house and try to figure out this, fight off these monsters, and, like, it's crazy because as the protagonist, he has no freaking clue what is going on, and as the reader, neither do we. We don't really understand the point of what's going on at all until we get to the end and we're like, whoa! And I just love books that can do that it's like, we're going on a crazy wild ride where the entire time I'm just like so strapped in. I love everything about it. I want to know more. I want to see what other wild, fantastical things he has to battle and like the obstacles that he has to overcome. And then it's like, well, what's the catch? Like, what's happening? I just love like adventure fantasy novels that are kind of bounded within and rooted within this like reality and but with like this magic that makes it woo kind of bizarre. I just love stories like that. So the next genre of book that I really enjoy are literary fiction novels about women that are gritty and pretentious and bizarre and homoerotic. I mean, sometimes it's not even about women, but like usually about someone who's not really happy with their life and what the fuck goes on because of that. And I think some examples of this would be obviously the iconic Otessa Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation and Eileen, which are both about lonely, weird women who are struggling with family trauma and their pasts and not knowing who they are, but fundamentally hating everything about themselves, and like the self-loathing as well as the insanity of the environments that they're in. For here, it's the alcoholic ex-cop dad in a tiny town called Xville and working at a juvenile detention center for boys. And for this one, it's like Columbia grad, both parents died unexpectedly, now, you know, trying to sleep for a year, using like drugs and excessive drug abuse while being in toxic relationships with like an older man and having a gross best friend who you actually kind of hate. So yeah, I think like this is kind of the blueprint of weird women books, I feel. And this book particularly is well beloved for a reason. And another book that kind of fits that trope is Pizza Girl by Jean Young Fraser. This book is about an 18-year-old pizza girl in LA who's pregnant from her like high school sweetheart, and she's dealing with, well, her dad was an alcoholic who died and due to alcohol poisoning, and her mother is a Korean immigrant and who's very soft-spoken and just wants the best for her child, but our main character doesn't even know what she wants for herself, and she ends up getting into this like weird homoerotic relationship with this lady that gets a particular pizza delivery every, Wednesday or something. And this book is also really sad and gritty and dark in the ways that I enjoy. And I think other examples of this would be The New Me by, why am I blanking on this author's name? But anyway, you see it. The New Me, Milk Fed, Vacuum in the Dark, The Subtweet, Less. All of these books are like these adult literary fiction novels featuring main characters who just don't really know what the fuck is going on, and they're really trying to figure it out. And I just love books like that. So I think a book that is like that, but that I haven't really enjoyed, the only example of that has been Luster by Raven Leilani so far. I tried to read like the first few pages and I was just like, I'm not really vibing with this. I don't know. So I kind of checked out of that one. But I know that that's a book that people would recommend to me after the list of books that I gave. Oh, also another book on that list would be The Mars Room, which is about a women's prison and the different people who work there and who are prisoners there. Just gritty, dark stories about women and queer people. I love them. I think they're so cool and awesome. The next genre of books is like a subgenre of like crime, thriller, mysteries, and that is quirky murder mystery novels. I love a book that is quirky and is trying to be funny and has just cute vibes all throughout, even though it's a story about a murder. And I think two good examples of this genre that I think really capture the tone that I'm trying to talk about is An Elderly Lady is Up to No Good by Helene Kirsten. This book was translated from Swedish, I believe, and it is a collection of like short stories surrounding an elderly lady who goes around like causing a little bit of mayhem, but in a way that is very particular and calculated and due to her own desires for her life. And it's just so fascinating. And I love when women do things, especially when they're like older women who have nothing else to do, and they are trying to make their lives as convenient for themselves as possible. And because everyone perceives our main character as like just a little old lady, they don't really suspect her of anything, even though she is up to no good. And another example of this type of book is Fortune Favors the Dead by Stephen Spotswood, which is set in the 40s in New York City, and we're investigating a crime murder featuring our main character and main perspective, Willow Jean, who is a runaway from home as a teenager, joined the circus, and now is an assistant to this detective lady, and it's just such a fun book. Like, the tone is very lighthearted, even though there's a lot of kind of heavier things explored throughout the book, and I just think that just like the quirkiness of these like murder mysteries, I just love it, and I eat it up, and I want more. So if you have any recommendations, let me know. The next genre of book I want to talk about is like a genre or subcategory within like horror, and this is horror that is deeply speculative in that it is criticizing something about the world or society, or it's something more kind of like meta almost, and it's like creepy and unsettling in how it is talking about the way that the world works. So for example, like Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, or Ring Shout by P.J. Clark, The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, Tenders the Flesh, which is about a world in which people are eating human meat, or like I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid, which really fucks with your mind and your perception. Maybe even like Lock Every Door by Riley Sager, or When No One Is Home, or When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. Stuff like that. Things that comment on class stratification or racism or gender in this very interesting way in how it's incorporated into horror, or like, the human condition and our minds and the way that the world is set up. Like, whoa, there's so creepy things about that. Like, I just love that type of speculative horror. The next genre of book I want to talk about is another like literary fiction type, maybe historical fiction novel type of story, and generational stories and stories about families throughout time. For example, Transcendent Kingdom by Yaa Gyasi is about a neuroscience researcher who grew up as a Black immigrant in Georgia, and her brother suffered from addiction and died from an overdose when she was young, and she is very intelligent, and she's researching addiction on the brain, and she has a very strained relationship with her mother and her father, who abandoned them when they were young. And I think that the kind of generational family drama element of that, as well as Ya Jesse's other book, Homegoing, that follows literally the lineage and descendant of two people, starting from like 4 centuries ago, all the way up throughout all the historical events leading up to modern time. And I think that it was so beautifully done, and I think another good example of this type of story that kind of travels throughout time and follows a family saga is These Ghosts Are Family by Maisie Card, which follows a Jamaican family and the complicated relationships and dynamics of within the diaspora, and also like Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, where we're following different women and different people in Britain who are in different places in their lives and who are each other's mothers and sisters and lovers and parents and whatever. It's like, it's just so, I love seeing the way that everyone's relationships with each other are so deeply tangled together and nuanced and detailed and just so gorgeous. It's like rendered in a way that feels so deeply realistic and so true to life. Another example of that type of story would be like Real Life by Brandon Taylor, I feel. Another kind of like generational family story that I think would also fit this, that I really enjoyed, is A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Ruman. I'm forgetting the author's name. But anyway, this book is about a Palestinian woman and her moving to like Brooklyn with this like man who she doesn't really know, and then having daughters, and then those daughters not really knowing their mother because she like died. It talks about the way that like gender and culture and family and religion influences the way that these girls and these women see each other and see themselves and interact with the world, and it's so tragic and beautiful and very beautifully done. I think a more magical version of that kind of story is The Prophets by Robert Jones, I think. This book kind of follows the life of people who are enslaved on a Mississippi plantation, and also the people who, like the community of the young people and the older women and the pastor and the relationship that they have with the plantation owners, and also the lineage of the people who are enslaved, and the fact that we kind of get interjections of the ancestors throughout the book and their perspective on things and their kind of understandings of the world. And it's also kind of this biblical metaphor as well, because each of the different chapters are called books of the Bible. It's a generational story that is expansive, not only in the amount of like people and space and time that it covers, but also in the humanity and beauty that is rendered within each and every character. So I love stories like that. A book on my TBR that kind of reminds me of this generational story and like drama that you guys were telling me to read in my last and most recent video, and that is Pachinko by Minjin Lee. I have heard that family legacies and family stories, and I love shit like that. I eat it up, so I'm excited to get to this. The next subgenre of books I want to talk about is very weird, vaguely religious historical fantasy. I'm talking about Lent by Joe Walton, which is kind of talking about this guy who's like a pope or like a bishop. I don't fucking know. He was like some religious figure during the Renaissance, and it kind of talks about like the Medicis and like the social and religious hierarchies at the times. And basically like this real life person claimed to be able to see demons and like banish them and cast them away. So the author kind of within the story creates this character who actually can see demons and actually does talk to God. It's just so crazy, like the way that Catholicism is portrayed and the mysticism of Catholicism is explored in this fantastical way, and I just really enjoyed it. And I think another example of that is Nama by Sarah Blake, which is this queer retelling of the story of Noah and the Ark and the flooding of the earth, because it takes on this feminist queer perspective, because we talk about and explore the inner life of Noah's wife, who in the Bible or in the Torah doesn't really have a name even. And so in this book, she is given the name Nama, and we explore her desires and her life and the actual reality of what it would be like to live on a ship with two of every creature on the earth on there. And I think it's so marvelous in its retelling and imagination, and just very deeply rich and luscious in its storytelling. Another example of the story, of this type of story, is The Library of Legends by Janie Chang, where we kind of talk about the Chinese Civil War as well as the Sino-Japanese War and the political factions within China during this time through this magical lens. It's very beautiful and well done, I think, and the political and magical intrigue throughout it, I think, is just very interesting and beautiful. Yeah, that's the kind of book I'm talking about. If you have any other recommendations of like weird, magical, religious, historical stories, let me know. Oh, I think another example of this might be The Sin Eater, which is about like medieval times. There would always be one poor wench, poor woman in the village to be assigned the Sin Eater, who would go to the deathbeds of people, who would then tell them their sins, and then the Sin Eater would eat types of food in accordance to whatever sin, so that they would then, like, metaphorically and metaphysically embody the sins of the person before they die, so that the person could die and not go to hell. And because that was their job, and they literally bared the sins of society and of their village and their town, they were shunned and like treated as like the bottom rung in tiers of society, even though they were like necessary and to the social and religious and cultural hierarchies of the time. So they were treated like they were lepers and treated as even less worthy than like sex workers within the context of this time, and like, you know, were like spat on the street, like no one would touch them or speak to them, and sin eaters were not allowed to speak unless they were within these ceremonies. So I think this book talks about that, and then like this not only magical but also like cultural and religious elements of the historical fiction. I really enjoyed it. The next genre of book I love is quirky girl has problems but is kind of unaware of them or doesn't want to address them. I love stories like that, and I think an example of that would be Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. Our main character has a slew of mental illnesses and trauma and things that just go kind of unresolved, but we see how it affects her everyday life, in how she treats other people and how she interacts with other people and how other people think she's very strange and neurotic, but she's just very deeply traumatized, and also just a bizarre person who I think is still at the core of who she is, like very lovable, and it's how the story is about how she finds herself to be someone who is worth loving and worth community and worth care for. And I think it's just so beautiful and tender and sweet, and I love stories like that. And I think that another book that's similar is Normal People by Sally Rooney, where our two main characters are people who are kind of like star-crossed lovers, but in a very realistic, grounded sense and way. Our main female character, Marianne, is also someone who we can deeply sympathize for, but we also understand the sort of disgust people have aimed at her. No, I think it's really beautiful and unique. Like, I just love quirky girl stories, right? Another example of that would be this graphic novel, Harley Quinn Breaking Glass, where, you know, Harley Quinn is, in this book, your average teenage girl who's been kicked out of her home because of just really bad family situation, and now she's living with a bunch of drag queens in this New York City falling apart apartment, and she's going to like the nearby public high school, and the drag show nights at the bar below the apartment are about to, like, the space is about to be shut down due to like gentrification, and Harley Quinn becomes friends with this girl at school who's family are community activists and organizers who fight against this gentrification, and the antagonist of the story is boy who is like the child of the company that is doing the gentrification, who goes to their high school and is a menace. I just think this book is such a really interesting take on Harley Quinn and her teenagehood and her adolescence, and how she's like really misunderstood and just really kind of wants the best for herself and her community, but doesn't really know exactly how to go about doing that. And I think that that's true for, I just love stories about, like, you know, girls who are kind of fucking up, but it's okay. Okay, it's okay. Finally, the last genre of book that I just absolutely adore is like magical realism. Very subtle, to the point that it's like, is it even magical realism? Like, is that actually just magic, or do I even know? And it's like kind of about contemporary millennial life almost. And a good example of that would be Sourdough by Robin Sloan, which is such a weird, fun little book about a Silicon Valley woman who gets involved in making sourdough bread because she orders food from this like tiny company, and like they claim to be from like a country that might not exist, with customs that she's trying to look up but can't find anything on the internet for. But now she's started basically like a bread company, and now she's incorporating that into like her tech world stuff. And like, I don't know, it's just so interesting. And I think that like that element of like magical realism, but is so fascinating, and I love it. Another example of this kind of just category would be Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson, where this girl is a nanny for this rich ass senator's kids, and these kids are very traumatized and have had very interesting and poor life experiences. They also have a very interesting thing of bursting into flames whenever they get too upset. So our main character, as these kids' nannies, has to figure out how to like navigate all of this, especially within this like big mansions, like, you know, senator's house, like swanky southern guy. And like, I don't know, it was just the perfect blend of like weird magical stuff that feels so real. And it's like, yeah, what would you do if you were trying to babysit kids who could spontaneously burst in flames at any point? Like, I don't fucking know. I don't know what I would do, which is why I really enjoyed reading that book. So yeah, those are all the subgenre categories, tropes of stories and books that I love. So if you have any recommendations based off of this list of tropes and subcategories and subgenres, please let me know, especially if they are books and especially if they are movies. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all that bullshit, whatever. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye!